Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys about an exercise that I personally feel is a very valuable squat accessory movement and just general lower body hypertrophy exercise that brings a lot to the table. Now, when I say that I feel like it has helped bring my squat up a bit further, like the last 10, 15 pounds on my squat, because I've been doing it regularly, getting strong at it. A lot of people will say, well, Jason, couldn't someone argue that you do tons of max effort squatting and then you do hypertrophy exercises and that's why your squat's going up? And that's a fair argument, and actually I would say that that is a correct response. That's a correct response because that is how you get any low skill exercise up. Because I'll be honest with you guys, a squat is not a high skill movement. Some people will argue that it is, and that's fine. Not a high skill exercise. Neither is a deadlift. Arguably the bench is the most complex of the big three. And even then, it's not super complex, not compared to, say, weightlifting. We're nowhere near that level. So let's go over to the point. That is how you get good at any big basic exercise. You do heavy singles, and in my case, I don't even do the classic back squat. I've done the classic back squat one time this last year, once, and hit a PR. The only time I did it. We do these variations, and I won't do a back squat again until I can PR. Basically, every time I do a squat, I PR. But it is the volume training and the hypertrophy training itself that gives us the potential to squat more. And when I say that, I don't mean that singles don't cause some hypertrophy. They do. Okay, they do. And there's no hypertrophy rep range, but we need training volume. We come over to something like the hip thrust, and the hip thrust is an exercise that's fairly easy to recover from. It works all the muscles of the lower body, and it's an exercise that we can load through a substantial range of motion. Normally, we would say things like, well, Jason, don't you oftentimes say that exercises that let you do lighter weight to get the same amount of stimulation are better? So why is this exercise that you use such a heavy weight good? Because it actually, in regards to that point, is better than the alternatives to it, right? The glute bridge you can use more weight on. The glute bridge uses slightly less quad. So even though the glute bridge is actually a phenomenal exercise for lower body hypertrophy, the hip thrust is for that purpose because a slightly longer range of motion, slightly lighter weight, slightly more quad activation, I think is a little more specific to the squat than the glute bridge is. And it's not to say the glute bridge wouldn't improve your squat, because it will. But this is a better version, and look at what muscles get worked doing this exercise. Okay, people think of it oftentimes just as a glute exercise. They're like, well, it's a glute exercise. And that's very true. But the only reason people think of it as a glute exercise is because there's only a handful of exercises that recruit the glutes maximally based upon the data that we have. Squats and deadlifts and things recruit them just not as much as these exercises do. Right? Glute bridges, hip thrusts, things like that. Because they hit them harder, we think of them as glute exercises. But look what else gets used. The quads in EMGs get hit almost as hard with a hip thrust as they do with a back squat. The hamstrings get harder. Glutes get hit harder. It hits the spinal erectors, the abdominals. Even works your hips to a very, very large degree. Well, what muscles do we use in the squat? Those are all the muscles we use in the squat. Which of them is easier to recover from? Okay, which of them is easier to recover from? I do right here in this clip, and this is from one workout, 5 sets of 10, 425. My goal is to get to sets of 10 with 500. Okay, 5 sets of 10 with 425. It's the last time you did that with a barbell squat. I do this every squat workout, which basically means every 4 days. Okay, are you going to recover from a squat with that kind of workload? Are you going to take close to your 10 rep max on a squat and do 5 sets of it? No, you're not going to do that. It's easier to recover from, less axial loading. For the same reason that we do things like the barbell step-ups or split squats, less axial loading. but it works all the muscles of the spine, and that's the difference. A lot of people say, well, couldn't someone just do a leg press? Okay, if you think a leg press is going to increase your squat as much as a hip thrust, I don't know what you're smoking. There's no core involvement. In fact, the leg press takes so much time and work to set up to get any effective strength gain. And in fact, when I say that, people will say, oh, you're exaggerating how much weight you and other people can use on the leg press. No, it's because you're scared, and in your head you think it's a heavy weight and your body shuts down. Most of you guys who are doing leg presses for sets of 10 should probably be doing another 400 or 500 pounds on there. You're just scared to add it up, and it feels heavy because you think it's heavy in your head. I promise you, if you actually really tried, if you just every workout went ahead and added 100 pounds, within a month or 5 weeks, you'd be doing 500 more pounds on the leg press. If you convinced yourself that you could, okay? So the problem is it's so much work to set up, and it's hard on the low back. The hip thrust actually works all of that because you need stability through your trunk. You need stability through your trunk. And in my experience, a leg press is just a very injury-prone exercise. People get hurt on the leg press more than they do on a lot of other lifts. I don't like it. And it can't compete with this. So before people throw that in, as I've had that brought up, can you just squat and do leg presses? Well, no, you're just building your legs. Okay, there's a lot more to a squat. A squat is back and hips and glutes. All of those muscles get worked on the hip thrust. Now, some people will point out, and this used to be a phobia for me, and people are going to say, wow, that's being a dick, Jason. Because I noticed that Brett Contreras obviously has really heavily promoted this, been one of the leading proponents for it, and he can't squat. Like, Brett has never had anything remotely resembling an impressive squat, even in powerlifting meets. And so a lot of times that could be used to say the hip thrust doesn't work. But I think it's because Brett just has never trained the squat, and he doesn't know how to squat. He's never taken the month to learn how to squat, and I think that's ultimately what it is. Because I look at his other lifts, and it doesn't make sense, and the hip thrust does increase your squat. It's increased my squat. So I don't think that's necessarily a valid argument. It's one I've had to deal with myself. For me, that was one reason I was reluctant to rely on this exercise heavily, was purely because Brett and some of these guys who promote this lift really suck at squatting, and they can't squat. Like, they have squat strength that is embarrassingly low, in spite of doing all this lower body work. But I digress. I don't think that's the reason. I think it's because they simply do not train the squat or know how to squat. And that's fine. So let's come over to the point. The data says that the hip thrust will increase your squat. I've experimented with it and found my squat creeping up, using it as my primary hypertrophy exercise for my lower body. So I'm going to go in the direction of the data and my personal anecdote versus using other people's anecdote. I think that's a safer route, and therefore I endorse it. I use it in my own training. And here's what we have to look at. There's been studies done on this, and there was a study done on, I believe it was it female college athletes? I believe that's who it was, but it was female athletes. And you guys can find this stuff yourself. I don't have time to look these up. I film these videos a month ahead of time. There's no way I'm going to dig up the study later and remember what studies get mentioned in a specific video. You guys all have Google. You can find them the same way I did. If you care, and very few people care. That's why it's not worth it. Like 3 people want to read this study, and they all have Google on their computer. So there was a study done on this where they took like an 8-week training program where they had them do all squats, and they had the other group do all hip thrusts, and they trained them hard with progressive overload. At the end of the 8 weeks, they tested their max squat. Both groups saw similar increases in their max squat. Now, people will look at that and say, well, that doesn't make sense, Jason. How could their squat go up without doing the squat? Because a squat is not a high skill exercise. I didn't squat for 10 months. I did nothing but box squats and supplemental work. And the last time I had done a squat on camera, it's obviously not my lifetime best, was 485 the last time I did a heavy squat. And that was my all-out max. And without doing any back squatting, and after rehabbing myself, because I had a pull that wasn't even fully training related, I got up to 425. but I had done 485. I went 10 months without doing a single back squat and walked in and hit a 522. So, no, you don't have to back squat to get good at the squat. These are not high skill exercises. Anyone who tells you that the squat, bench, and deadlift are difficult exercises to learn, or that there's a high skill component, that skill component gives you the last 10 pounds. Okay, high skill component takes a 300 bench and turns it into a 315 bench. Like, because you'll potato press 300, and if you get really skilled, it'll turn into 315 with the same size and strength. Okay, same thing with the back squat. If you can potato squat 475, you can dial your technique in perfectly and hit 500. Right, that's the reality of it. So no, they didn't have to squat. If you already know how to squat, and you build all the muscles up involved with the squats at the right joint angle, your squat will go up. That's something people don't like to hear. Well, that's what they did in that study, and it worked. The hip thrust increased their max squat just as much as the squat program did. And I think, based upon my understanding of training and the way the human body works, that study's believable, because that is the way it works. My own life experience and understanding exactly matches what happened in that study. So, perfectly reasonable. So what does that study tell us about the hip thrust? It tells us the hip thrust can build your squat. Therefore, it is a phenomenal supplemental lift or hypertrophy exercise for improving your squat. And I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't squat at all, by the way, like they did in the program. I'm simply saying that it's possible. Doesn't mean that it's optimal. But yeah, the hip thrust is a very valuable tool for increasing your squat and just general lower body hypertrophy. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.